Today we delve into A Warning to the Curious and Other Ghost Stories by M.R. James. This collection is renowned for its chilling tales that evoke the eerie and the supernatural. James's masterful storytelling takes us through haunting narratives that linger long after the final word. Prepare yourself for a journey into the unknown as we explore some of the most spine-tingling ghost stories ever penned. Chapter 1. The Haunted Doll's House. "I suppose you get stuff of that kind through your hands pretty often," said Mr. Dillett, as he pointed with his stick to an object which shall be described when the time comes, and when he said it, he lied in his throat, and knew that he lied. Not once in 20 years, perhaps not once in a lifetime, could Mr. Chittenden, skilled as he was in ferreting out the forgotten treasures of half a dozen counties, expect to handle such a specimen. It was collector's palaver, and Mr. Chittenden recognized it as such. "Stuff of that kind, Mr. Dillett? It's a museum piece, that is." "Well, I suppose there are museums that'll take anything." "I've seen one, not as good as that, years back," said Mr. Chittenden thoughtfully. "But that's not likely to come into the market, and I'm told they have some fine ones of the period over the water." "No, I'm only telling you the truth, Mr. Dillett, when I say that if you was to place an unlimited order with me for the very best that could be got, and you know I have facilities for getting to know of such things, and a reputation to maintain, well, all I can say is I should lead you straight up to that one and say, 'I can't do no better for you than that, sir.'" "Hear, hear," said Mr. Dillett, applauding ironically with the end of his stick on the floor of the shop. "How much are you sticking the innocent American buyer for it, eh?" "Oh, I shan't be over hard on the buyer, American or otherwise. You see, it stands this way, Mr. Dillett. If I knew just a bit more about the pedigree, or just a bit less," Mr. Dillett put in. "Ha ha, you will have your joke, sir." "No, but as I was saying, if I knew just a little more than what I do about the piece, though anyone can see for themselves it's a genuine thing, every last corner of it. And there's not been one of my men allowed to so much as touch it since it came into the shop. There'd be another figure in the price I'm asking. And what's that, 5 and 20? Multiply that by 3 and you've got it, sir. 75's my price. And 50's mine," said Mr. Dillett. The point of agreement was, of course, somewhere between the two. It does not matter exactly where. I think 60 guineas. But half an hour later the object was being packed, and within an hour Mr. Dillett had called for it in his car and driven away. Mr. Chittenden, holding the cheque in his hand, saw him off from the door with smiles, and returned, still smiling, into the parlour where his wife was making the tea. He stopped at the door. "It's gone," he said. "Thank God for that," said Mrs. Chittenden, putting down the teapot. "Mr. Dillett, was it?" "Yes, it was. Well, I'd sooner it was him than another." "Oh, I don't know. He ain't a bad fellow, my dear." "Maybe not, but in my opinion he'd be none the worse for a bit of a shake-up." "Well, if that's your opinion, it's my opinion he's put himself into the way of getting one. Anyhow, we shan't have no more of it, and that's something to be thankful for." And so Mr. and Mrs. Chittenden sat down to tea. And what of Mr. Dillett and of his new acquisition? What it was, the title of this story will have told you. What it was like, I shall have to indicate as well as I can. There was only just room enough for it in the car, and Mr. Dillett had to sit with the driver. He had also to go slow, for though the rooms of the doll's house had all been stuffed carefully with soft cotton wool, jolting was to be avoided. In view of the immense number of small objects which thronged them, and the 10-mile drive was an anxious time for him, in spite of all the precautions he insisted upon. At last his front door was reached, and Collins, the butler, came out. "Look here, Collins, you must help me with this thing. It's a delicate job. We must get it out upright, see? It's full of little things that mustn't be displaced more than we can help. Let's see, where shall we have it?" After a pause for consideration, "Really, I think I shall have to put it in my own room to begin with, at any rate. On the big table, that's it." It was conveyed, with much talking, to Mr. Dillett's spacious room on the first floor, looking out on the drive. The sheeting was unwound from it, and the front thrown open, and for the next hour or two Mr. Dillett was fully occupied in extracting the padding and setting in order the contents of the rooms. When this thoroughly congenial task was finished, I must say that it would have been difficult to find a more perfect and attractive specimen of a doll's house in Strawberry Hill Gothic than that which now stood on Mr. Dillett's large knee-hole table, lighted up by the evening sun which came slanting through 3 tall sash windows. It was quite 6 feet long, including the chapel or oratory which flanked the front on the left as you faced it, and the stable on the right. The main block of the house was, as I have said, in the Gothic manner. That is to say, the windows had pointed arches and were surmounted by what are called ogival hoods, with crockets and finials such as we see on the canopies of tombs built into church walls. At the angles were absurd turrets covered with arched panels. The chapel had pinnacles and buttresses, and a bell in the turret and coloured glass in the windows. When the front of the house was open, you saw 4 large rooms, bedroom, dining room, drawing room and kitchen, each with its appropriate furniture in a very complete state. The stable on the right was in 2 stories, with its proper complement of horses, coaches and grooms, and with its clock and Gothic cupola for the clock bell. Pages, of course, might be written on the outfit of the mansion. How many frying pans, how many gilt chairs, what pictures, carpets, chandeliers, 4 posters, table linen, glass, crockery and plate it possessed, but all this must be left to the imagination. I will only say that the base or plinth on which the house stood, for it was fitted with one of some depth which allowed of a flight of steps to the front door and a terrace, partly balustraded, contained a shallow drawer or drawers in which were neatly stored sets of embroidered curtains, changes of raiment for the inmates, and, in short, all the materials for an infinite series of variations and refittings of the most absorbing and delightful kind. Quintessence of Horace Walpole, that's what it is. He must have had something to do with the making of it. Such was Mr. Dillett's murmured reflection as he knelt before it in a reverent ecstasy. Simply wonderful. This is my day and no mistake. £500 coming in this morning for that cabinet which I never cared about, and now this tumbling into my hands for 1/10, at the very most, of what it would fetch in town. Well, well, it almost makes one afraid something'll happen to counter it. Let's have a look at the population anyhow. Accordingly, he set them before him in a row. Again, here is an opportunity, which some would snatch at, of making an inventory of costume. I am incapable of it. There were a gentleman and lady, in blue satin and brocade respectively. There were 2 children, a boy and a girl. There was a cook, a nurse, a footman, and there were the stable servants, 2 postilions, a coachman, 2 grooms. Anyone else? Yes, possibly. The curtains of the 4-poster in the bedroom were closely drawn round 4 sides of it, and he put his finger in between them and felt in the bed. He drew the finger back hastily, for it almost seemed to him as if something had, not stirred perhaps, but yielded, in an odd live way as he pressed it. Then he put back the curtains, which ran on rods in the proper manner, and extracted from the bed a white-haired old gentleman in a long linen nightdress and cap, and laid him down by the rest. The tale was complete. Dinner-time was now near, so Mr. Dillett spent but 5 minutes in putting the lady and children into the drawing-room, the gentleman into the dining-room, the servants into the kitchen and stables, and the old man back into his bed. He retired into his dressing-room next door, and we see and hear no more of him until something like 11 o'clock at night. His whim was to sleep surrounded by some of the gems of his collection. The big room in which we have seen him contained his bed, bath, wardrobe, and all the appliances of dressing were in a commodious room adjoining, but his 4-poster, which itself was a valued treasure, stood in the large room where he sometimes wrote, and often sat, and even received visitors. Tonight he repaired to it in a highly complacent frame of mind. There was no striking clock within earshot, none on the staircase, none in the stable, none in the distant church tower. Yet it is indubitable that Mr. Dillett was startled out of a very pleasant slumber by a bell-tolling one. He was so much startled that he did not merely lie breathless with wide-open eyes, but actually sat up in his bed. He never asked himself, till the morning hours, how it was that, though there was no light at all in the room, The doll's house on the knee-hole table stood out with complete clearness. But it was so. The effect was that of a bright harvest moon shining full on the front of a big white stone mansion. A quarter of a mile away it might be, and yet every detail was photographically sharp. There were trees about it too, trees rising behind the chapel and the house. He seemed to be conscious of the scent of a cool, still September night. He thought he could hear an occasional stamp and clink from the stables, as of horses stirring, and with another shock he realized that, above the house, he was looking, not at the wall of his room with its pictures, but into the profound blue of a night sky. There were lights, more than one, in the windows, and he quickly saw that this was no four-roomed house with a movable front, but one of many rooms and staircases, a real house. But seen as if through the wrong end of a telescope. "You mean to show me something?" he muttered to himself, and he gazed earnestly on the lighted windows. They would in real life have been shuttered or curtained, no doubt, he thought, but as it was, there was nothing to intercept his view of what was being transacted inside the rooms. 2 rooms were lighted, one on the ground floor to the right of the door, one upstairs on the left. The first brightly enough, the other rather dimly. The lower room was the dining room. A table was laid, but the meal was over, and only wine and glasses were left on the table. The man of the blue satin and the woman of the brocade were alone in the room, and they were talking very earnestly, seated close together at the table, their elbows on it, every now and again stopping to listen, as it seemed. Once he rose, came to the window and opened it, and put his head out and his hand to his ear. There was a lighted taper in a silver candlestick on a sideboard. When the man left the window, he seemed to leave the room also, and the lady, taper in hand, remained standing and listening. The expression on her face was that of one striving her utmost to keep down a fear that threatened to master her, and succeeding. It was a hateful face too, broad, flat and sly. Now the man came back and she took some small thing from him and hurried out of the room. He too disappeared, but only for a moment or two. The front door slowly opened, and he stepped out and stood on the top of the perron, looking this way and that, then turned towards the upper window that was lighted, and shook his fist. It was time to look at that upper window. Through it was seen a 4-post bed, a nurse or other servant in an armchair, evidently sound asleep. In the bed, an old man lying, awake, and one would say, anxious, from the way in which he shifted about and moved his fingers, beating tunes on the coverlet. Beyond the bed a door opened. Light was seen on the ceiling, and the lady came in. She set down her candle on a table, came to the fireside and roused the nurse. In her hand she had an old-fashioned wine bottle, ready uncorked. The nurse took it, poured some of the contents into a little silver saucepan, added some spice and sugar from casters on the table, and set it to warm on the fire. Meanwhile the old man in the bed beckoned feebly to the lady, who came to him, smiling, took his wrist as if to feel his pulse, and bit her lip as if in consternation. He looked at her anxiously, and then pointed to the window, and spoke. She nodded, and did as the man below had done, opened the casement and listened, perhaps rather ostentatiously, then drew in her head and shook it, looking at the old man, who seemed to sigh. By this time the posset on the fire was steaming, and the nurse poured it into a small 2-handled silver bowl and brought it to the bedside. The old man seemed disinclined for it, and was waving it away, but the lady and the nurse together bent over him, and evidently pressed it upon him. He must have yielded, for they supported him into a sitting position and put it to his lips. He drank most of it, in several draughts, and they laid him down. The lady left the room, smiling good night to him, and took the bowl, the bottle, and the silver sauce-pan with her. The nurse returned to the chair, and there was an interval of complete quiet. Suddenly the old man started up in his bed, and he must have uttered some cry, for the nurse started out of her chair and made but one step of it to the bedside. He was a sad and terrible sight, flushed in the face, almost to blackness, the eyes glaring whitely, both hands clutching at his heart, foam at his lips. For a moment the nurse left him, ran to the door, flung it wide open, and, one supposes, screamed aloud for help, then darted back to the bed and seemed to try feverishly to soothe him, to lay him down, anything. But as the lady, her husband, and several servants rushed into the room with horrified faces, the old man collapsed under the nurse's hands and lay back, and the features, contorted with agony and rage, relaxed slowly into calm. A few moments later, lights showed out to the left of the house, and a coach with flambeaux drove up to the door. A white-wigged man in black got nimbly out and ran up the steps, carrying a small leather trunk-shaped box. He was met in the doorway by the man and his wife, she with her handkerchief clutched between her hands, he with a tragic face but retaining his self-control. They led the newcomer into the dining room, where he set his box of papers on the table, and, turning to them, listened with a face of consternation at what they had to tell. He nodded his head again and again, threw out his hands slightly, declined, it seemed, offers of refreshment and lodging for the night, and within a few minutes came slowly down the steps, entering the coach, and driving off the way he had come. As the man in blue watched him from the top of the steps, a smile not pleasant to see stole slowly over his fat white face. Darkness fell over the whole scene as the lights of the coach disappeared. But Mr. Dillett remained sitting up in the bed. He had rightly guessed that there would be a sequel. The house front glimmered out again before long. But now there was a difference. The lights were in other windows, one at the top of the house, the other illuminating the range of coloured windows of the chapel. How he saw through these is not quite obvious, but he did. The interior was as carefully furnished as the rest of the establishment, with its minute red cushions on the desks, its Gothic stall canopies, and its western gallery and pinnacled organ with gold pipes. On the centre of the black and white pavement was a bier. 4 tall candles burned at the corners. On the bier was a coffin covered with a pall of black velvet. As he looked, the folds of the pall stirred. It seemed to rise at one end. It slid downwards. It fell away, exposing the black coffin with its silver handles and nameplate. One of the tall candlesticks swayed and toppled over. Ask no more, but turn, as Mr. Dillett hastily did, and look in at the lighted window at the top of the house, where a boy and girl lay in 2 truckle beds, and a 4-poster for the nurse rose above them. The nurse was not visible for the moment, but the father and mother were there, dressed now in mourning, but with very little sign of mourning in their demeanour. Indeed, they were laughing and talking with a good deal of animation, sometimes to each other, and sometimes throwing a remark to one or other of the children, and again laughing at the answers. Then the father was seen to go on tiptoe out of the room, taking with him as he went a white garment that hung on a peg near the door. He shut the door after him. A minute or two later it was slowly opened again, and a muffled head poked round it. A bent form of sinister shape stepped across to the truckle beds, and suddenly stopped, threw up its arms and revealed, of course, the father laughing. The children were in agonies of terror, the boy with the bedclothes over his head, the girl throwing herself out of bed into her mother's arms. Attempts at consolation followed. The parents took the children on their laps, patted them, picked up the white gown and showed there was no harm in it, and so forth. And at last, putting the children back into bed, left the room with encouraging waves of the hand. As they left it, the nurse came in, and soon the light died down. Still Mr. Dillett watched, immovable. A new sort of light, not of lamp or candle, a pale, ugly light, began to dawn around the doorcase at the back of the room. The door was opening again. The seer does not like to dwell upon what he saw entering the room. He says it might be described as a frog, the size of a man, but it had scanty white hair about its head. It was busy about the truckle beds, but not for long. The sound of cries, faint, as if coming out of a vast distance, but even so infinitely appalling, reached the ear. There were signs of a hideous commotion all over the house. Lights passed along and up, and doors opened and shut, and running figures passed within the windows. The clock in the stable turret tolled 1, and darkness fell again. It was only dispelled once more to show the house front. At the bottom of the steps, dark figures were drawn up in 2 lines, holding flaming torches. More dark figures came down the steps, bearing first one, then another small coffin, and the lines of torch-bearers with the coffins between them moved silently onward to the left. The hours of night passed on, never so slowly, Mr. Dillett thought. Gradually he sank down from sitting to lying in his bed, but he did not close an eye, and early next morning he sent for the doctor. The doctor found him in a disquieting state of nerves, and recommended sea air. To a quiet place on the east coast he accordingly repaired by easy stages in his car. One of the first people he met on the seafront was Mr. Chittenden, who, it appeared, had likewise been advised to take his wife away for a bit of a change. Mr. Chittenden looked somewhat askance upon him when they met, and not without cause. "Well, I don't wonder at you being a bit upset, Mr. Dillett." "What?" "Yes, well, I might say, horrible upset to be sure, seeing what me and my poor wife went through ourselves. But I put it to you, Mr. Dillett, one of two things: was I going to scrap a lovely piece like that on the one, or was I going to tell customers, I'm selling you a regular picture palace drama in real life of the olden time, billed to perform regular at 1 o'clock a.m. Why, what would you have said yourself? And next thing you know, 2 justices of the peace in the back parlour, and poor Mr. and Mrs. Chittenden off in a spring cart to the county asylum, and everyone in the street saying, "Ah." I thought I'd come to that. Look at the way the man drank. And me next door, or next door but one, to a total abstainer, as you know. Well, there was my position. What? Me leave it back in the shop? Well, what do you think? No, but I'll tell you what I will do. You shall have your money back, bar the £10 I paid for it, and you make what you can. Later in the day, in what is offensively called the smoke room of the hotel, a murmured conversation between the two went on for some time. How much do you really know about that thing and where it came from? Honest, Mr. Dillett, I don't know the house. Of course, it came out of the lumber room of a country house, that anyone could guess, but I'll go as far as say this, that I believe it's not 100 miles from this place. Which direction, and how far, I've no notion. I'm only judging by guesswork. The man as I actually paid the cheque to ain't one of my regular men, and I've lost sight of him, but I have the idea that this part of the country was his beat, and that's every word I can tell you. But now, Mr. Dillett, there's one thing that rather physics me. That old chap, I suppose you saw him drive up to the door. I thought so now. Would he have been the medical man, do you take it? My wife would have it so, but I stuck to it, that was the lawyer, because he had papers with him, and one he took out was folded up. I agree, said Mr. Dillett. Thinking it over, I came to the conclusion that was the old man's will, ready to be signed. Just what I thought, said Mr. Chittenden, and I took it that will would have cut out the young people, eh? Well, well, it's been a lesson to me, I know that. I shan't buy no more dolls' houses, nor waste no more money on the pictures, and as to this business of poisoning Grandpa, well, if I know myself, I never had much of a turn for that. Live and let live, that's been my motto throughout life, and I ain't found it a bad one. Filled with these elevated sentiments, Mr. Chittenden retired to his lodgings. Mr. Dillett next day repaired to the local institute, where he hoped to find some clue to the riddle that absorbed him. He gazed in despair at a long file of the Canterbury and York Society's publications of the parish registers of the district. No print resembling the house of his nightmare was among those that hung on the staircase and in the passages. Disconsolate, he found himself at last in a derelict room, staring at a dusty model of a church in a dusty glass case, model of St. Stephen's Church, Coxham, presented by J. Merewether, Esquire, of Ilbridge House, 1877. The work of his ancestor James Merewether, d. 1786. There was something in the fashion of it that reminded him dimly of his horror. He retraced his steps to a wall map he had noticed, and made out that Ilbridge House was in Coxham parish. Coxham was, as it happened, one of the parishes of which he had retained the name when he glanced over the file of printed registers, and it was not long before he found in them the record of the burial of Roger Milford, aged 76, on the 11th of September, 1757, and of Roger and Elizabeth Merewether, aged 9 and 7, on the 19th of the same month. It seemed worthwhile to follow up this clue, frail as it was, and in the afternoon he drove out to Coxham. The east end of the north aisle of the church is a Milford chapel, and on its north wall are tablets to the same persons. Roger, the elder it seems, was distinguished by all the qualities which adorn the father, the magistrate, and the man. The memorial was erected by his attached daughter Elizabeth, who did not long survive the loss of a parent ever solicitous for her welfare, and of 2 amiable children. The last sentence was plainly an addition to the original inscription. A yet later slab told of James Merewether, husband of Elizabeth, who in the dawn of life practiced, not without success, those arts which, had he continued their exercise, might in the opinion of the most competent judges have earned for him the name of the British Vitruvius, but who, overwhelmed by the visitation which deprived him of an affectionate partner and a blooming offspring, passed his prime and age in a secluded yet elegant retirement. His grateful nephew and heir indulges a pious sorrow by this too brief recital of his excellencies. The children were more simply commemorated. Both died on the night of the 12th of September. Mr. Dillett felt sure that in Ilbridge House he had found the scene of his drama. In some old sketchbook, possibly in some old print, he may yet find convincing evidence that he is right. But the Ilbridge House of today is not that which he sought. It is an Elizabethan erection of the 40s, in red brick with stone coins and dressings. A quarter of a mile from it, in a low part of the park, backed by ancient stag-horned ivy-strangled trees and thick undergrowth, are marks of a terraced platform overgrown with rough grass. A few stone balusters lie here and there, and a heap or two, covered with nettles and ivy, of wrought stones with badly carved crockets. This, someone told Mr. Dillett, was the site of an older house. As he drove out of the village, the hall clock struck 4, and Mr. Dillett started up and clapped his hands to his ears. It was not the first time he had heard that bell. Awaiting an offer from the other side of the Atlantic, the doll's house still reposes, carefully sheeted, in a loft over Mr. Dillett's stables. Wither Collins conveyed it on the day when Mr. Dillett started for the sea coast. Chapter 2. The Uncommon Prayer Book. Chapter 2. 1. Mr. Davidson was spending the first week in January alone in a country town. A combination of circumstances had driven him to that drastic course. His nearest relations were enjoying winter sports abroad, and the friends who had been kindly anxious to replace them had an infectious complaint in the house. Doubtless he might have found someone else to take pity on him. But, he reflected, most of them have made up their parties, and after all, it is only for 3 or 4 days at most that I have to fend for myself. And it will be just as well if I can get a move on with my introduction to the Leaventhorpe papers. I might use the time by going down as near as I can to Goulsford and making acquaintance with the neighbourhood. I ought to see the remains of Leaventhorpe House and the tombs in the church. The first day after his arrival at the Swan Hotel at Longbridge was so stormy that he got no farther than the tobacconist's. The next, comparatively bright, he used for his visit to Goulsford, which interested him more than a little, but had no ulterior consequences. The third, which was really a pearl of a day for early January, was too fine to be spent indoors. He gathered from the landlord that a favourite practice of visitors in the summer was to take a morning train to a couple of stations westward, and walk back down the valley of the Tent, through Stanford St. Thomas and Stanford Magdalen, both of which were accounted highly picturesque villages. He closed with this plan, and we now find him seated in a third-class carriage at 9:04 a.m., on his way to Kingsbourne Junction, and studying the map of the district. One old man was his only fellow traveller, a piping old man, who seemed inclined for conversation. So Mr. Davidson, after going through the necessary versicles and responses about the weather, inquired whether he was going far. "No, sir, not far, not this morning, sir," said the old man. "I ain't only going so far as what they call Kingsbourne Junction. There isn't but 2 stations betwixt here and there. Yes, they calls it Kingsbourne Junction." "I'm going there too," said Mr. Davidson. "Oh, indeed, sir. Do you know that part? No, I'm only going for the sake of taking a walk back to Longbridge and seeing a bit of the country. Oh, indeed, sir. Well, 'tis a beautiful day for a gentleman, as enjoys a bit of a walk. Yes, to be sure. Have you got far to go when you get to Kingsbourne? No, sir. I ain't got far to go once I get to Kingsbourne Junction. I'm a-going to see my daughter, sir. She live at Broxton. That's about 2 mile across the fields from what they call Kingsbourne Junction, that is. You've got that marked down on your map, I expect, sir. I expect I have. Let me see, Broxton, did you say? Here's Kingsbourne. Yes. And which way is Broxton toward the Stanfords? Ah, I see it, Broxton Court in a park. I don't see the village, though. No, sir, you wouldn't see no village of Broxton. There ain't only the court and the chapel at Broxton. Chapel? Oh, yes, that's marked here, too. The chapel close by the court, it seems to be. Does it belong to the court? Yes, sir, that's close up to the court, only a step. Yes, that belonged to the court. My daughter, you see, sir, she's the keeper's wife now, and she live at the court and look after things now the family's away. No one living there now, then? No, sir, not for a number of years. The old gentleman, he lived there when I was a lad, and the lady, she lived on after him to very near upon 90 years of age. And then she died. And them that have it now, they've got this other place, in Warwickshire, believe it is, and they don't do nothing about letting the court out. But Colonel Wildman, he have the shooting, and young Mr. Clark, he's the agent. He come over once in so many weeks to see to things, and my daughter's husband, he is the keeper. And who uses the chapel? Just the people round about, I suppose. Oh no, no one don't use the chapel. Why, there ain't no one to go. All the people about, they go to Stanford St. Thomas Church, but my son-in-law, he go to Kingsbourne Church now, because the gentleman at Stanford, he have this Gregory singing, and my son-in-law. He don't like that. He say he can hear the old donkey braying any day of the week, and he likes something a little cheerful on the Sunday. The old man drew his hand across his mouth and laughed. That's what my son-in-law say. He say he can hear the old donkey, etc. da capo. Mr. Davidson also laughed as honestly as he could, thinking meanwhile that Broxton Court and Chapel would probably be worth including in his walk. For the map showed that from Broxton he could strike the Tent Valley quite as easily as by following the main Kingsbourne-Longbridge road. So, when the mirth excited by the remembrance of the son-in-law's bon mot had died down, he returned to the charge, and ascertained that both the court and the chapel were of the class known as old-fashioned places, and that the old man would be very willing to take him thither, and his daughter would be happy to show him whatever she could. But that ain't a lot, sir. Not as if the family was living there. All the looking-glasses is covered up, and the paintings, and the curtains and carpets folded away. Not but what I dare say she could show you a pair just to look at, because she go over them to see as the moth shouldn't get into 'em. I shan't mind about that, thank you. If she can show me the inside of the chapel, that's what I'd like best to see. Oh, she can show you that right enough, sir. She have the key of the door, you see, and most weeks she go in and dust about. That's a nice chapel, that is. My son-in-law, he say he'll be bound they didn't have none of this Gregory singing there. Dear, I can't help but smile when I think of him saying that about the old donkey. I can hear him bray, he say, any day of the week, and so he can, sir, that's true anyway. The walk across the fields from Kingsbourne to Broxton was very pleasant. It lay for the most part on the top of the country, and commanded wide views over a succession of ridges, plough and pasture, or covered with dark blue woods all ending, more or less abruptly, on the right, in headlands that overlooked the wide valley of a great western river. The last field they crossed was bounded by a close copse, and no sooner were they in it than the path turned downward very sharply, and it became evident that Broxton was neatly fitted into a sudden and very narrow valley. It was not long before they had glimpses of groups of smokeless stone chimneys and stone-tiled roofs, close beneath their feet. And, not many minutes after that, they were wiping their shoes at the back door of Broxton Court, while the keeper's dogs barked very loudly in unseen places, and Mrs. Porter, in quick succession, screamed at them to be quiet, greeted her father, and begged both her visitors to step in. Chapter 2. 2. It was not to be expected that Mr. Davidson should escape being taken through the principal rooms of the court, in spite of the fact that the house was entirely out of commission. Pictures, carpets, curtains, furniture were all covered up or put away, as old Mr. Avery had said, and the admiration which our friend was very ready to bestow had to be lavished on the proportions of the rooms. And on the one painted ceiling, upon which an artist who had fled from London in the plague year had depicted the triumph of loyalty and defeat of sedition. In this Mr. Davidson could show an unfeigned interest. The portraits of Cromwell, Ireton, Bradshaw, Peters, and the rest, writhing in carefully devised torments, were evidently the part of the design to which most pains had been devoted. That were the old Lady Sadleir had that painting done, same as the one what put up the chapel. They say she were the first that went up to London to dance on Oliver Cromwell's grave. So said Mr. Avery, and continued musingly, "Well, I suppose she got some satisfaction to her mind, but I don't know as I should want to pay the fare to London and back just for that, and my son-in-law. He say the same. He say he don't know as he should have cared to pay all that money only for that. I was telling the gentleman as we came along in the train, Mary, what your Harry says about this Gregory singing down at Stanford here. We had a bit of a laugh over that, sir, didn't us?" "Yes, to be sure we did, ha-ha." Once again Mr. Davidson strove to do justice to the pleasantry of the keeper. "But," he said, "if Mrs. Porter can show me the chapel, I think it should be now, for the days aren't long, and I want to get back to Longbridge before it falls quite dark. Even if Broxton Court has not been illustrated in rural life, and I think it has not, I do not propose to point out its excellences here, but of the chapel a word must be said. It stands about 100 yards from the house, and has its own little graveyard and trees about it. It is a stone building about 70 feet long, and in the Gothic style, as that style was understood in the middle of the 17th century. On the whole, it resembles some of the Oxford College chapels as much as anything, save that it has a distinct chancel, like a parish church, and a fanciful domed bell turret at the southwest angle. When the west door was thrown open, Mr. Davidson could not repress an exclamation of pleased surprise at the completeness and richness of the interior. Screenwork, pulpit, seating, and glass all were of the same period, and as he advanced into the nave and sighted the organ case with its gold-embossed pipes in the western gallery, his cup of satisfaction was filled. The glass in the nave windows was chiefly armorial, and in the chancel were figure subjects of the kind that may be seen at Abbey Door of Lord Scudamore's work. But this is not an archaeological review. While Mr. Davidson was still busy examining the remains of the organ, attributed to one of the Dallams, I believe, old Mr. Avery had stumped up into the chancel and was lifting the dust cloths from the blue velvet cushions of the stall desks. Evidently it was here that the family sat. Mr. Davidson heard him say in a rather hushed tone of surprise, "Why, Mary, here's all the books open again." The reply was in a voice that sounded peevish rather than surprised. Well, there I never." Mrs. Porter went over to where her father was standing, and they continued talking in a lower key. Mr. Davidson saw plainly that something not quite in the common run was under discussion, so he came down the gallery stairs and joined them. There was no sign of disorder in the chancel any more than in the rest of the chapel, which was beautifully clean, but the 8-folio prayer books on the cushions of the stall desks were indubitably open. Mrs. Porter was inclined to be fretful over it. "Whoever can it be as does it?" she said, "for there's no key but mine, nor yet door but the one we came in by, and the winders is barred, every one of 'em. I don't like it, father, that I don't." "What is it, Mrs. Porter?" "Anything wrong?" said Mr. Davidson. "No, sir, nothing really wrong, only these books. Every time, pretty near, that I come in to do up the place, I shuts 'em and spreads the cloths over 'em to keep off the dust, ever since Mr. Clark spoke about it when I first come. And yet there they are again, and always the same page, and as I says, whoever it can be, as does it with the door and winders shut. And as I says, it makes anyone feel queer coming in here alone, as I ave to do, not as I'm given that way myself, not to be frightened easy. I mean to say, and there's not a rat in the place, not as no rat wouldn't trouble to do a thing like that, do you think, sir? Hardly, I should say, but it sounds very queer. Are they always open at the same place, did you say? Always the same place, sir. One of the Psalms it is. And I didn't particularly notice it the first time or two, till I see a little red line of printing. And it's always caught my eye since. Mr. Davidson walked along the stalls and looked at the open books. Sure enough, they all stood at the same page, Psalm 6. And at the head of it, just between the number and the Deus Laudum, was a rubric, for the 25th day of April. Without pretending to minute knowledge of the history of the Book of Common Prayer, he knew enough to be sure that this was a very odd and wholly unauthorized addition to its text. And though he remembered that April 25 is St. Mark's Day, he could not imagine what appropriateness this very savage psalm could have to that festival. With slight misgivings, he ventured to turn over the leaves to examine the title page, and knowing the need for particular accuracy in these matters, he devoted some 10 minutes to making a line-for-line transcript of it. The date was 1653. The printer called himself Anthony Cadman. He turned to the list of proper psalms for certain days, yes. Added to it was that same inexplicable entry for the 25th day of April, the 109th psalm. An expert would no doubt have thought of many other points to inquire into, but this antiquary, as I have said, was no expert. He took stock, however, of the binding, a handsome one of tooled blue leather, bearing the arms that figured in several of the nave windows in various combinations. "How often," he said at last to Mrs. Porter, "have you found these books lying open like this?" "Really, I couldn't say, sir, but it's a great many times now. Do you recollect, Father, me telling you about it the first time I noticed it?" "That I do, my dear. You was in a rare taking. And I don't so much wonder at it. That was 5 year ago. I was paying you a visit at Michaelmas time, and you come in at tea time, and says you, 'Father, there's the books laying open under the cloth sagin,' and I didn't know what my daughter was speaking about, you see, sir. And I says, 'Books?' Just like that, I says, and then it all came out. But as Harry says, that's my son-in-law, sir, whoever it can be, he says. As does it, because there ain't only the one door, and we keeps the key locked up, he says. And the winders is barred, every one on 'em. Well, he says, I lay once I could catch 'em at it. They wouldn't do it a second time, he says. And no more they wouldn't, I don't believe, sir. Well, that was 5 year ago, and it's been happening constant ever since by your account, my dear. Young Mr. Clark, he don't seem to think much to it, but then he don't live here, you see, and 'tisn't his business to come and clean up here of a dark afternoon. Is it? I suppose you never notice anything else odd when you are at work here, Mrs. Porter? Said Mr. Davidson. No, sir, I do not, said Mrs. Porter, and it's a funny thing to me I don't, with the feeling I have as there's someone set in here. No, it's the other side, just within the screen, and looking at me all the time I'm dusting in the gallery and pews. But I never yet see nothing worse than myself, as the saying goes, and I kindly hope I never may. Chapter 2-3. In the conversation that followed, there was not much of it. Nothing was added to the statement of the case. Having parted on good terms with Mr. Avery and his daughter, Mr. Davidson addressed himself to his 8-mile walk. The little valley of Broxton soon led him down into the broader one of the tent and on to Stanford St. Thomas, where he found refreshment. We need not accompany him all the way to Longbridge. But as he was changing his socks before dinner, he suddenly paused and said half aloud, By Jove, that is a rum thing. It had not occurred to him before how strange it was that any edition of the prayer book should have been issued in 1653, 7 years before the Restoration, 5 years before Cromwell's death, and when the use of the book, let alone the printing of it, was penal. He must have been a bold man who put his name and a date on that title page. Only, Mr. Davidson reflected, it probably was not his name at all, for the ways of printers in difficult times were devious. As he was in the front hall of the Swan that evening, making some investigations about trains, a small motor stopped in front of the door, and out of it came a small man in a fur coat, who stood on the steps and gave directions in a rather yapping foreign accent to his chauffeur. When he came into the hotel, he was seen to be black-haired and pale-faced, with a little pointed beard, and gold pince-nez altogether very neatly turned out. He went to his room, and Mr. Davidson saw no more of him till dinner time, as they were the only two dining that night. It was not difficult for the newcomer to find an excuse for falling into talk. He was evidently wishing to make out what brought Mr. Davidson into that neighborhood at that season. "Can you tell me how far it is from here to Arlingworth?" was one of his early questions, and it was one which threw some light on his own plans. For Mr. Davidson recollected having seen at the station an advertisement of a sale at Arlingworth Hall, comprising old furniture, pictures and books. This, then, was a London dealer. "No," he said. "I've never been there. I believe it lies out by Kingsbourne. It can't be less than 12 miles. I see there's a sale there shortly." The other looked at him inquisitively, and he laughed. "No," he said, as if answering a question. "You needn't be afraid of my competing. I'm leaving this place tomorrow." This cleared the air, and the dealer, whose name was Homburger, admitted that he was interested in books, and thought there might be in these old country house libraries something to repay a journey. "For," said he, "we English have always this marvelous talent for accumulating rarities in the most unexpected places. Ain't it?" And in the course of the evening he was most interesting on the subject of finds made by himself and others. "I shall take the occasion after this sale to look round the district a bit. Perhaps you could inform me of some likely spots, Mr. Davidson." But Mr. Davidson, though he had seen some very tempting locked-up bookcases at Broxstone Court, kept his counsel. He did not really like Mr. Homburger. Next day, as he sat in the train, a little ray of light came to illuminate one of yesterday's puzzles. He happened to take out an almanac diary that he had bought for the new year, and it occurred to him to look at the remarkable events for April 25. There it was, St. Mark Oliver Cromwell born, 1599. That, coupled with the painted ceiling, seemed to explain a good deal. The figure of old Lady Sadler became more substantial to his imagination, as of one in whom love for church and king had gradually given place to intense hate of the power that had silenced the one and slaughtered the other. What curious evil service was that which she and a few like her had been wont to celebrate year by year in that remote valley? And how in the world had she managed to elude authority? And again, did not this persistent opening of the books agree oddly with the other traits of her portrait known to him? It would be interesting for anyone who chanced to be near Broxstone on the 25th of April to look in at the chapel and see if anything exceptional happened. When he came to think of it, there seemed to be no reason why he should not be that person himself, he, and if possible, some congenial friend. He resolved that so it should be. Knowing that he knew really nothing about the printing of prayer books, he realized that he must make it his business to get the best light on the matter, without divulging his reasons. I may say at once that his search was entirely fruitless. One writer of the early part of the 19th century, a writer of rather windy and rhapsodical chat about books, professed to have heard of a special anti-Cromwellian issue of the prayer book in the very midst of the Commonwealth period. But he did not claim to have seen a copy, and no one had believed him. Looking into this matter, Mr. Davidson found that the statement was based on letters from a correspondent who had lived near Longbridge. So he was inclined to think that the Broxstone prayer books were at the bottom of it, and had excited a momentary interest. Months went on, and St. Mark's Day came near. Nothing interfered with Mr. Davidson's plans of visiting Broxstone, or with those of the friend whom he had persuaded to go with him, and to whom alone he had confided the puzzle. The same 9.45 train which had taken him in January took them now to Kingsbourne. The same field path led them to Broxstone. But today they stopped more than once to pick a cowslip. The distant woods and ploughed uplands were of another colour, and in the copse there was, as Mrs. Porter said, a regular charm of birds. Why, you couldn't hardly collect your mind sometimes with it. She recognized Mr. Davidson at once, and was very ready to do the honours of the chapel. The new visitor, Mr. Witham, was as much struck by the completeness of it as Mr. Davidson had been. "There can't be such another in England," he said. "Books open again, Mrs. Porter?" said Davidson, as they walked up to the chancel. "Dear, yes, I expect so, sir," said Mrs. Porter, as she drew off the cloths. "Well, there," she exclaimed the next moment, "if they ain't shut. That's the first time ever I found 'em so. But it's not for want of care on my part, I do assure you, gentlemen, if they wasn't. For I felt the cloths the last thing before I shut up last week. When the gentleman had done photographing the East Winder, and every one was shut, and where there was ribbons left, I tied 'em. Now I think of it, I don't remember ever to have done that before, and perhaps, whoever it is, it just made the difference to 'em. Well, it only shows, don't it? If at first you don't succeed, try again. Meanwhile, the two men had been examining the books, and now Davidson spoke. I'm sorry to say I'm afraid there's something wrong here, Mrs. Porter. These are not the same books. It would make too long a business to detail all Mrs. Porter's outcries and the questionings that followed. The upshot was this. Early in January, the gentleman had come to see over the chapel and thought a great deal of it, and said he must come back in the spring weather and take some photographs. And only a week ago he had drove up in his motoring car and a very eerie box with the slides in it, and she had locked him in because he said something about a long explosion. And she was afraid of some damage happening, and he says no, not explosion. But it appeared the lantern what they take the slides with worked very slow. And so he was in there the best part of an hour, and she come and let him out. And he drove off with his box and all and gave her his visiting card. And oh dear, dear, to think of such a thing. He must have changed the books and took the old ones away with him in his box. What sort of man was he? Oh dear, he was a small-made gentleman, if you can call him so after the way he've behaved with black hair. That is, if it was hair and gold eyeglasses. If they was gold, really, one don't know what to believe. Sometimes I doubt he weren't a real Englishman at all, and yet he seemed to know the language and had the name on his visiting card like anybody else might. Just so. Might we see the card? Yes, T.W. Henderson, and an address somewhere near Bristol. Well, Mrs. Porter, it's quite plain this Mr. Henderson, as he calls himself, has walked off with your 8 prayer books and put 8 others about the same size in place of them. Now listen to me. I suppose you must tell your husband about this, but neither you nor he must say one word about it to anyone else. If you'll give me the address of the agent, Mr. Clark, isn't it? I will write to him and tell him exactly what has happened, and that it really is no fault of yours. But, you understand, we must keep it very quiet. And why? Because this man who has stolen the books will of course try to sell them one at a time, for I may tell you they are worth a good deal of money, and the only way we can bring it home to him is by keeping a sharp lookout and saying nothing. By dint of repeating the same advice in various forms, they succeeded in impressing Mrs. Porter with the real need for silence, and were forced to make a concession only in the case of Mr. Avery, who was expected on a visit shortly. But you may be safe with father, sir, said Mrs. Porter. Father ain't a talking man. It was not quite Mr. Davidson's experience of him. Still, there were no neighbours at Broxton, and even Mr. Avery must be aware that gossip with anybody on such a subject would be likely to end in the Porters having to look out for another situation. A last question was whether Mr. Henderson, so-called, had anyone with him. No, sir, not when he come, he hadn't. He was working his own motoring car himself, and what luggage he had, let me see, there was his lantern and this box of slides inside the carriage, which I helped him into the chapel and out of it myself with it. If only I'd knowed. And as he drove away under the big yew tree by the monument, I see the long white bundle laying on the top of the coach, what I didn't notice when he drove up. But he sat in front, sir, and only the boxes inside behind him. And do you really think, sir, as his name weren't Henderson at all? Oh dear me, what a dreadful thing. Why, fancy what trouble it might bring to an innocent person that might never have set foot in the place but for that. They left Mrs. Porter in tears. On the way home, there was much discussion as to the best means of keeping watch upon possible sales. What Henderson Homburger, for there could be no real doubt of the identity, had done, was, obviously, to bring down the requisite number of folio prayer books, disused copies from college chapels and the like, bought ostensibly for the sake of the bindings, which were superficially like enough to the old ones, and to substitute them at his leisure for the genuine articles. A week had now passed without any public notice being taken of the theft. He would take a little time himself to find out about the rarity of the books, and would ultimately, no doubt, place them cautiously. Between them, Davidson and Witham were in a position to know a good deal of what was passing in the book world, and they could map out the ground pretty completely. A weak point with them at the moment was that neither of them knew under what other name or names Henderson Homburger carried on business. But there are ways of solving these problems, and yet all this planning proved unnecessary. Chapter 2, 4. We are transported to a London office on this same 25th of April. We find there, within closed doors late in the day, 2 police inspectors, a commissionaire, and a youthful clerk. The 2 latter, both rather pale and shaky in appearance, are sitting on chairs and being questioned. How long do you say you've been in this Mr. Poschwitz's employment? 6 months. And what was his business? Attended sales in various parts and brought home parcels of books. Did he keep a shop anywhere? No. Disposed of 'em here and there, and sometimes to private collectors. Right. Now then, when did he go out last? Rather better than a week ago. Tell you where he was going? No. Said he was going to start next day from his private residence and shouldn't be at the office. That's here, eh? Before 2 days you was to attend as usual. Where is his private residence? Oh, that's the address Norwood Way, I see. Any family? Not in this country? Now then, what account do you give of what's happened since he came back? Came back on the Tuesday, did he? And this is the Saturday. Bring any books? 1 package, where is it? In the safe? You got the key? No, to be sure, it's open, of course. How did he seem when he got back cheerful? Well, but how do you mean curious? Thought he might be in for an illness, he said that, did he? Odd smell got in his nose. Couldn't get rid of it. Told you to let him know who wanted to see him before you let him in. That wasn't usual with him? Much the same all Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Out a good deal, said he was going to the British Museum. Often went there to make inquiries in the way of his business. Walked up and down a lot in the office when he was in. Anyone call in on those days? Mostly when he was out. Anyone find him in? Oh, Mr. Collinson. Who's Mr. Collinson? An old customer. Know his address. All right, give it us afterwards. Well now, what about this morning? You left Mr. Poschwitz's here at 12 and went home. Anybody see you? Commissionaire, you did? Remained at home till summoned here. Very well. Now, Commissionaire, we have your name Watkins, eh? Very well, make your statement. Don't go too quick, so as we can get it down. I was on duty later than usual. Mr. Potwitch having asked me to remain on, and ordered his lunching to be sent in, which came as ordered. I was in the lobby from 11:30 on, and see Mr. Blythe the clerk leave at about 12. After that no one come in at all except Mr. Potwitch's lunching come at 1 o'clock, and the man left in 5 minutes' time. Towards the afternoon I became tired of waiting, and I come upstairs to this first floor. The outer door what lead to the office stood open, and I come up to the plate glass door here. Mr. Potwitch, he was standing behind the table smoking a cigar, and he laid it down on the mantelpiece and felt in his trouser pockets and took out a key and went across to the safe. And I knocked on the glass, thinking to see if he wanted me to come and take away his tray, but he didn't take no notice, being engaged with the safe door. Then he got it open and stooped down, and seemed to be lifting up a package off of the floor of the safe. And then, sir, I see what looked to be like a great roll of old shabby white flannel, about 4 to 5 feet high. Fall forwards out of the inside of the safe right against Mr. Potwitch's shoulder as he was stooping over, and Mr. Potwitch, he raised himself up as it were, resting his hands on the package, and gave an exclamation. And I can't hardly expect you should take what I says, but as true as I stand here, I see this roll had a kind of a face in the upper end of it, sir. You can't be more surprised than what I was, I can assure you, and I've seen a lot in me time. Yes, I can describe it if you wish it. Sir, it was very much the same as this wall here in colour. The wall had an earth-coloured distemper, and it had a bit of a band tied round underneath. And the eyes, well, they was dry-like, and much as if there was 2 big spiders' bodies in the holes. Hair? No, I don't know, as there was much hair to be seen. The flannel stuff was over the top of the eed. I'm very sure it wasn't what it should have been. No, I only see it in a flash, but I took it in like a photographed wish I hadn't. Yes, sir, it fell right over onto Mr. Potwich's shoulder, and this face hid in his neck, yes, sir, about where the injury was, more like a ferret going for a rabbit than anything else. And he rolled over, and of course I tried to get in at the door, but as you know, sir, it were locked on the inside, and all I could do, I rung up everyone, and the surgeon come, and the police and you gentlemen, and you know as much as what I do. If you won't be requiring me any more today, I'd be glad to be getting off home. It shook me up more than I thought for. Well, said one of the inspectors when they were left alone. And, well, said the other inspector, and after a pause, what's the surgeon's report again? You've got it there. Yes. Effect on the blood like the worst kind of snake bite, death almost instantaneous. I'm glad of that. For his sake, he was a nasty sight. No case for detaining this man Watkins anyway, we know all about him. And what about this safe now? We'd better go over it again. And by the way, we haven't opened that package he was